I wanted to do a very short reading from the new introduction to this new edition, which I've strengthened and strengthened linguistically in very important ways, updated very lightly because it's a document in history. I don't want to change it. I don't want to break into it. But I've also expanded the resources that are now available. There are websites that are extraordinary, that are deconstructing the defamation minute by minute, around the clock. And I've listed as many of them. And these, as I was telling Richard, we are like the chalutzim and chalutzot who were clearing the malarial swamps inch by inch, because the big lies are the swamp. And it will take dedication and perseverance from many of us for a very long time to accomplish that mission. So here's how I begin the new introduction. Once again, the Jews are under the most profound siege. Once again, the world stands idly by, and worse, demonizes Israel for daring to defend herself. Like so many, I had assumed that the world's hatred and persecution of Jews had ended, that Jewish history would never again repeat itself. I was wrong. We are perhaps in the midst of a slow-motion Holocaust, or trapped in a real-life horror movie. Jews face multiple intifadas. In Israel, human homicide bombers and an endless rain of rockets have terrorized, wounded, and murdered a massive number of Israeli civilians and soldiers. And yet Israel, not Israel's attackers, has been relentlessly defamed in the world media. The most sickening blood libels are back, and since 2001, maybe since 2000, they're back with a vengeance, and they are surreal, and their combined effect is a clear incitement to genocide. The words in this book are burning words. They are hot to the touch. They leap off the page and into living history. They remain as true now, perhaps more so, as they were when I first published the book. When the planes of 9/11 crashed through history and destroyed the World Trade Center and part of the Pentagon, I understood, now we are all Israelis. Henceforth, the entire world would have to endure what Israel alone had faced. And today we have a perfect storm of a politically correct Western intelligentsia joining forces with death-eating Islamic fundamentalists and jihadists in an effort to destroy not only Israel, but Israel as the symbol of Western civilization. We are involved in a war between barbarism and post-Enlightenment civilization. So I've strengthened and clarified. I no longer use the phrase suicide killers because they're human homicide bombs. The word suicide evokes a misplaced sympathy, pity. Maybe they're suffering so much that they're killing themselves. Now, the phrase suicide killers best describes the Western intelligentsia because they are weakening the West from within and thus enabling the suicide of Western civilization in the name of Western anti-racist, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist values. I wrote this book in white heat almost around the clock, and I had no idea of what would happen once it was published. And of course, what happened to me, maybe early on, but it's happened to all of us. We then get treated as pariahs, challenged. I need police protection when I speak on an American campus. And I'm accused of being a racist, an Islamophobe, an American patriot,
paranoid,
a paranoid, a demon conservative, a Republican, and the worst is a Zionist, which I proudly am. That was the dirtiest word. She's become a Zionist. So what must we do? What must we do? Well, we have to do everything, and we have to start yesterday. We can never afford to give up hope, because Israel is the first line of resistance in a very strangely paralyzed free world in the fight against barbaric totalitarianism. And this is not surprising, since the Jews are an extraordinary people who have survived for millennia against great odds. We may be weary, but remain determined to both survive and thrive, and heroism is our only alternative. In the vacuum created by the failure of organized Jewry to fight back preemptively in the war of ideas, and I include the Israeli government in this, sorry to say, we can always count on the Pintele Yid, the ordinary Jew, who begins the back-breaking labor without benefit of salary, pension, or status. Herzl came to understand this, as did Jabotinsky and Bergson, Hillel Kook, and Begin. And in the last 20 years, but more so after the advent of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, many individuals have been hard at work draining the swamps of Jew hatred. And like our pioneer ancestors, we will continue to do so until the truth begins to bloom. As Jews, as Israelis, as members of a nation holy unto God, we must understand and never forget that ours is an eternal struggle. I end the introduction by talking about evil and slander and quoting from Psalm 120, which beseeches God to deliver my soul from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. My soul hath full long had her dwelling with him that hateth peace. I am all peace, but when I speak, they are for war. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch interprets the psalm in this way: the hatred of peace is implicit in the hatred of truth. Falsehood deprives all things and all people of the soil on which they could live and prosper. I declare frankly and without reserve the truth which was entrusted to me, so that I may make it known to mankind. But as for them, their hatred of truth also makes them the foes of peace, and they are the ones who perpetuate the state of war that prevails on earth. From the psalmist's sweet lips to God's ear. Thank you. Yes, you like that? Okay.
So the idea here is that we're going to have a conversation which you're all welcome to join in on, so feel free to raise your hands. We might ignore you while we're trying to work out a point, but not for very long. What I'd like to say is, first of all, reading this book in preparation for this panel has been a singularly depressing experience. And it's not, as Phyllis pointed out to me earlier, it's not like I'm not conscious of this. I'm a medieval historian. I know about the very long and very painful history of anti-Semitism. But to take Phyllis's metaphor just one step further, we're draining a swamp that's being hit by continuous tsunamis. The tsunami of hatred of Israel and the tsunami of, to be generous, misinformation, to be more accurate, outright lies, that the media is consistently pouring into our public sphere, these tsunamis these are stories that Nidra Polar calls them lethal narratives. They're designed to create hatred. They're designed to create a desire for revenge. They're designed to incite war. And our media, very often believing that they're serving the cause of peace, which is one of the topics that we want to approach, which is how can so many smart people be so stupid? People who believe that they're supporting peace are in fact pumping our public sphere with war propaganda for the other side. which is really fairly unique in the history of mankind. Normally, you know, when the media gets involved in playing the war propaganda game, they're doing it for their own side, not for their enemies. And yet, that's what we're looking at now, which is really, you know, sort of, I call it own goal lethal journalism. So what I'd like to do to start with is to discuss, frame Phyllis's book within a development that's happened over the last 15 years that is nothing short of stunning. And I say this not from the point of view, just from the point of view of a contemporary inhabitant of this troubled globe, but as a medieval historian who really considers the last 2,500 years to be sort of my bailiwick. And even within the framework of 2,500 years, I would say that the events of the last 15 years are literally civilizationally staggering in their impact. And in order to give you an idea of what I mean by that, a quick anecdote about an experience with a high school and college friend of mine, Daniel Pipes, who came in 1997 to visit me. At the time, I was the head of the Center for Millennial Studies. I was studying, you know, messianic, apocalyptic, millennial stuff. I had actually published a piece in which I argued that we might be looking at the coming of another wave of anti-Semitism in the 1990s. And when I tried to talk to people, they literally laughed at me, and including Rabbi Sachs, who later wrote that when 9/11 happened, he thought, oh my gosh, maybe Richard Landis was right. So he came to visit me, we're talking, and I asked him what he was working on. He said, I'm working on this desire amongst jihadis to take over the world. So that's a millennial dream. The idea of world conquest is a classic millennial fantasy. And, you know, my first reaction, you know, he said, I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, they want the Queen to wear the Queen of England to wear a burqa, and they want the flag of, the green flag of Islam to fly from the White House. And, you know, my first reaction was to laugh. That's such an absurd idea. And then my second reaction as a millennialist, who, among other things, was writing a chapter at the time about the Nazis, I understood that just because one of the basic rules of millennialism is wrong does not mean inconsequential. All millennialists are wrong. The millennium is the messianic era has not yet come. So everybody I study was wrong, but that doesn't mean that they were by any means inconsequential in the amount of damage.
You know, I want to interrupt you for a minute, because I approached, after Copenhagen, I flew to Israel, I had meetings with Misrat HaChutz.
We're talking 1980?
1980,
right.
1980. I gave interviews on the front pages of Yediot Acharonot and maybe Ma'ariv about anti-Semitism, that it's back, that the UN has unleashed it. And when I came back to America, I met with some American Jewish organizations, and I said, look, they're going to be using the language of liberation and oppression coming from the left against us. Let me set up a curriculum of some kind. 1980. And I didn't say you had to pay me. I said it would be for free, but it had to be done. Nobody was exactly interested. So I thought, well, it's because I'm a woman. Then Richard tells me he tried it in the 1990s. Right. And he's not a woman, and he was met with the same
dismissal.
Oh, not really.
Don't be ridiculous.
Don't be an alarmist. You're hysterical. It's not really true, and so on. So this is the first problem. Is these are the people on our side, not the enemy forces.
And the story that I'm telling now is my dismissal. When I first heard of sort of the jihadi ambitions to spread Dar al-Islam to the entire globe, I thought it was absurd. There was no way that they were going to be able to do this. And then I had the second thought, which is, but they can do a lot of damage on their way to failure. What I don't think either I or the people who are really paying attention to this, like Dan Pipes or Stephen Emerson, who already in the 90s were, hot on the trail of this madness, ever expected was to have the West be so weak in its response. I don't think any of us expected the West to be such a pushover as it's been. And I think one of the main reasons it's been a pushover is the subject of Phyllis's book. I think that anti-Zionism, which is just the 21st century mutation of anti-Semitism, which is the 20th century mutation of Jew hatred, which is the longest standing hatred in the history of mankind, except for probably the hatred of self.
What's new about the
wait,
new...
Wait,
oh,
let me just finish this thought, because I'm
ahead.
at that age where I forget.
You're not the only one.
Right. So I think that anti-Zionism is the soft underbelly of the West in the cognitive war that jihad has been waging against the West. Cognitive war is the war that the weak side in an asymmetrical conflict needs to fight because it can't win on the battlefield. So it's got to be able to convince the enemy not to use its superior strength. That's what a cognitive war goal is, to convince a more powerful enemy not to use its power to resist. Normally, cognitive war is things like the Maccabees or the Viet Cong trying to convince a more powerful enemy that's invaded you to go home. Now, with global jihad, and in its local case in Israel with the Palestinian uprising against the West, and I call it the Oslo Jihad, not the Al-Aqsa Intifada.
True.
Yeah. In the case here, what we have is an invasion, not getting somebody to leave, but actually invading a more powerful enemy and convincing them not to resist, which, when you think of it, is insane. Who could ever do that? And yet, for the last 15 years, we've been watching this, and the irrationality that's documented in this, the absolute insanity amongst intellectuals that this book is full of and really deserves to be studied carefully, is the sort of ground upon which a kind of suicidal impulse has found expression in the West. And I think it's important to understand, Phyllis talked about the importance of defending the Jewish people. I want to say it's not just the Jewish people, it's Western democracy, it is civilization as we understand it that needs defense.
No, exactly.
And it needs defense not just from the attackers, but from the imbeciles who play the role of enabling them.
Well, but the problem, and well put, and we agree, the good people, the anti-racists, the politically correct intellectuals, the Nobel Prize winners, who you would think would not be prejudiced, on the contrary, have been hoodwinked and persuaded by this lethal narrative. They genuinely believe that Israel is a Nazi apartheid state that is occupying not disputed territories won in self-defense in war, but disputed territories that are really like an occupation, and it's apartheid-like. They believe this. They believe this. Therefore, as good people who are anti-racist, and if they're Americans, they're very busy still atoning for the history of slavery. They have no understanding of Islam's history of imperialism and colonialism and conversion via the sword and Islamic gender and religious apartheid for real, not for fake, and slavery today. They believe that the West, they have been taught since the 60s, and I was part of it, yes, to believe, mea culpa, to believe that the West is guilty existentially, essentially, as Israel now is seen as guilty, because Israel...
And uniquely.
Yes. As the blood tide rises, Muslim on Muslim violence, Muslim on infidel barbarism, atrocities incredible, as all of that is happening, where is the media focus? It's still on Israel. So it's slightly less because there's so much bloody atrocity happening in the neighborhood, and I'm worried about that because people are getting used to it. They're getting used to beheadings, severed arms, people coming at you to run you over with their car or to butcher you while you're at prayer in a synagogue. So the danger, since those scenes desensitize the normal human reaction, which should be, we must stop this now. We must do everything we can to stop it now. People say, oh, I already saw that. Oh, yeah, that's happening. And so as the ISIS phenomenon, which, by the way, is a diversion from nuclear Iran, let me be very clear about that. As the ISIS phenomenon is happening, you have ISIS-like barbarians beginning to do their bloody, dirty work in Jerusalem. That's what we've just seen. In Europe, Europe has a karmic, Europe is the continent that stood by or slaughtered 6 million peaceful, assimilated, productive Jews, or certainly non-violent Semites. Now Europe has a growing population of our cousins who are also Semites who mean to bring Europe down. And
they're doing penance for what they did to us by subjecting themselves to them.
Well, no, they're continuing their anti-Semitism by voting on behalf of, in the hope that it will appease the angry Muslim street, by voting for a Palestinian state. Today, France was the 5th nation in Europe to basically vote their Jew hatred out loud, a symbolic vote merely. And what does it mean to vote for a Palestinian state? I give this to you. I mean, we could both answer it.
It means to vote for another jihadi state. I mean, it's actually, I say another. This is one of the few states that will be a full-fledged jihadi state.
And the world seems to want it.
And it's staggering. I mean, actually, I think what should be happening, if the progressive left wanted to encourage peace, then the pressure would be on Arab countries to recognize Israel. If there's a round of recognitions of a state in the Middle East that needs to be done in order to encourage peace and bring on peace, then it's that the Arab states recognize Israel, because the refusal of Arab states to recognize Israel is the most revealing element of the conflict, which is that a state of independent infidels in the heart of Dar al-Islam is considered a mortal wound to an Islam that should dominate. And the ability of Islam to get along with Israel is, in fact, the litmus test of their ability to get along with the rest of the world, with infidels all over the world. We don't have an Islam yet, and we don't have a formal expression of Islam which is able to live in peace with infidels.
Well, for a long time, even after writing this book and doing all the work from then till now, 1,000 articles maybe, I didn't want to say, you know, it really is a religious war. Because I work with Muslims, with ex-Muslims, with Muslim dissidents and Muslim feminists who are very, very heroic. This is a very important alliance, by the way. And I was reluctant, and now I'm less reluctant. I've been forced by reality to see it is a religious war. And, you know, if you want to think of Nazi Germany, the good German people who may not have hated Jews or wished to slaughter 6 million or 11 million other human beings, they did nothing to stop Hitler. They didn't want to risk their lives or their happy and opportunistic lives. So the problem with Muslims is not that so many hundreds of millions really believe Jews are subhuman and poison Muhammad and deserve to be killed and you can't live with them, not even as subhumans. You have to wipe them out. The problem is all of the Muslims who are afraid of their leaders, who are tyrants, who are totalitarian dictators, who are torturers, and they're afraid and don't know how to go up against them. This brand of Islam is busy crucifying Christians in Pakistan, literally crucifying them. So this is not Iran. Let's not forget Iran. Iran is merrily making its way to nuclear power. This is something I've had my eye on since perhaps 2005 or sooner. And look at the American administration not dealing with it. Deadline passed. More deadlines passed as the centrifuges spin merrily along. Mm-hmm. So this is Iran is an Islamist state, as is Turkey, as is Syria now, Iraq, whatever is left of Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon. I mean, Egypt is a welcome sight. Egypt declares CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, to be a terrorist entity. This is a group that the American president has to the White House and consults with for information.
And the State Department steps in to defend them.
Yes, yes. So this is Orwell's nightmare or Orwell's vision. The truth is upside down. Everything is reversed. It's also, you know the novel by Jean Raspail? In the 1970s, a Frenchman publishes a novel about a flotilla, not the Mavi Marmara, but a flotilla making its way somewhere to Europe of people, doesn't say that they're Muslims, but sort of vaguely brown-skinned people, right? And the only place that allows them to land is France. And they take France down. He was initially, and it's a bitter dystopian novel, relentless, brilliant, and very difficult. He's attacked as a racist. Within about 5 years, secretly, European heads of state are consulting with him. But I note that, Raspail, I note that his publishers in America, in English, get smaller and smaller, and fewer people have heard of this book, which I strongly recommend. Now, the solutions are not simple. Europe is really paying for their crime of previous genocide and previous colonizations. They really are, in a karmic sense. Plus, they're still willing to sacrifice the Jew. That's Israel, the Jew of the world, in the hope that it will spare them a little bit. It's not going to. And you're looking for Raspail?
Yeah.
Oh, you found him. All right. No. What does it say? It's totally brilliant work. And I think it was a prescient vision. Nobody, and the good people in France, the multicultural, politically correctniks, who believe that all cultures are equal, and especially more than equal, Arab cultures, quote, Palestinians who never existed cultures, men of color cultures, no matter if they're beating up, raping, and murdering women of color, we can't criticize that because to do so would be racist. And it's very similar. So what is to be done? With your first question was, or I threw in, the good people. That means those who are not self-hating Jews, those who are not particularly anti-Zionist, who don't feel the pulse of history, who aren't that alarmed, who have other things more important to do. That's the first question. The second one might be all of the Jews who weren't that upset about the Kling Haffa opera, which is very anti-Semitic, but its anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. It's not the 7 or 8 lines, America is one big fat Jew. What's anti-Semitic about the opera was the staging, because I went in to see it. And there's the apartheid wall, and I'm thinking, wait, they kidnapped, so to speak, they hijacked the Achille Lauro in 1985. They grew up in so-called refugee camps in Lebanon in the 70s or the 60s. There was no apartheid wall. What is this apartheid wall? And the chorus, the exiled Palestinian chorus, rose up from the very earth itself, indigenous, Greek chorus, primeval. The Jews just came from Europe with battered suitcases. They were new arrivals. There was no history of Jews in the place, in the Metropolitan Opera staging. Not that many people were upset.
Let's go back to your first question, which is a really interesting one, which is this question of people who don't have a sense of history. As a historian, not only can I tell you that it's hard to acquire that, but in fact, enrollments in history classes have dropped precipitously over the last decade. People seem to think that if you take political science, which is a joke as long as it doesn't put science in quotes, if they take political science, they'll be in a position to have an impact, get a job and have an impact. I really think that it's terribly important for the younger generation to get this sense of history and to understand that, I mean, you know, I spoke at a shul in Philly last night. I speak at various places and on various occasions, the Begin Center in Jerusalem recently. You know, anybody who's under 40 brings down the median age by a significant amount. Young people aren't really showing up to these things. And I think that one of the reasons that they don't show up to them is they really don't have a sense of what's going on. They have no sense that there are subterranean and now above the surface currents which are literally going to change the world that we live in. I spend some time in Europe. Europeans don't have a clue, and when they have a clue, they don't know what to do about it. I was in Germany for a year. I spoke with Germans about this, and their answer was, there's really nothing we can do. We're actually more afraid of our own fascism than we are of Islamic fascism. And it was strange for me as a Jew to say, you know something, I'm more worried about their fascism than I'm worried about your fascism. It's really an extraordinary situation. We live in some of the most extraordinary times, and how we raise people's consciousness to understand that these are literally civilization-shaking events that are occurring. I'm not quite sure how to do it.
Well, 10 years ago, I began calling for a Jewish Al Jazeera. Now, what did I mean by that? I meant 24/7, all the languages of planet Earth, covering news, high quality, and when it came to the Middle East or Israel, it didn't defame Israel, it told the truth. It wasn't biased, it didn't buy into the lethal pseudo-narratives, but really looked at the truth. I kept saying this. I wrote articles, I said it out loud. I hoped, I prayed, maybe some Russian billionaires would hear me and they'd run with the idea, because that's one quick way of doing this kind of conversation that we're having. Needs to be had every hour in every language of every day, because our opponents, the slanderers and the liars, are doing it on the internet and in the world media and in all the human rights organizations and at the United Nations all the time. There is not a listserv group that I once belonged to that I could stay on. That means professional, groups, not just feminists, no. Psychologists, psychiatrists, feminist groups. The narrative, Israel comes in when it's least expected, has no relevance whatsoever, and you have to salute the flag of hating Israel if you want to be part of the group. So I actually was expunged from one listserv group because I kept challenging them. These were left feminists. And I write about it in a book called The Death of Feminism. And the feminism that I helped pioneer is a universal standard of human rights and is not politically correct, post-colonial, postmodern. We cared about language and about speaking clearly, not in the incomprehensible post-Lacanian language that the campuses, and nobody can understand at least what the feminists are saying. I can't anymore. And, but it's not just feminists, it's really not. And initially, Edward Said did huge harm, but with enormous funding. He's a dhimmi. He is a Christian, by the way, who's been the leading advocate for the Palestinian people that never existed. Women's liberation began to capture the imagination of the Western Academy through the 1970s. We were up against a lot of hostility and we were far from perfect, but we were happening. And then Edward Said happened, and all of a sudden the Arab man colonized by the white Western Orientalist was all the rage. It just preempted concern with women's rights. So
particularly since the world that he was validating was so primitive in its attitudes towards women.
You would think that's an alarming contradiction, but indeed, when I spoke at Columbia, where he spoke, together with my friend Ibn Warwick, nobody came. Ibn Warwick wrote the book that totally brought down Edward Said's work and picked apart Orientalism from the beginning, from beginning to end. No, none of the professors came. When I spoke at Santa Cruz, there was a huge turnout of Jews in the area. And I was sending messages to Angela Davis and Bettina Apteker. Angela, I marched for you when you were in jail in New York City. I want you to hear what I have to say. No response. No response. My former friend Alice Walker, who's very powerful, and who knows what her real reasons may be, but she's a pro-Mavi Marmara flotilla junkie. I don't understand how, well, I think there's something else that's happened in America, that the concern with racism against mainly African Americans in America has latched onto a concern with Palestinians, as if Palestinians are African Americans.
Have latched on to,
yeah,
right.
Well, of course, they're parasites, and they infiltrate everything, including Ferguson, which is unbelievable. Yeah. You know, there were banners in Ferguson, Missouri, against Israel, blaming Israel. You know, we stand with Palestine. So this cheap anti-racism is also part of what's going on. And now we have finally elected a black-looking president. And America is very proud of itself for having done so. I'm not so certain that this president is good for America or for the world. I mean, let's think.
You're not so certain?
I'm not so certain. Well, I'm being very diplomatic. I'm being very diplomatic. I am not a diplomat. Or an official, and I think I could do better in foreign affairs, and I've never done them. So I feared that he would be both an empty suit and a Manchurian candidate, and he's both. He's both, and he's smart. He's smart.
Yeah, well, actually, there are
Right?
two aspects of what you've been talking about that I'd like to pursue. One, this last comment, which is I really would like to pursue how it is that really smart people are able to be so disoriented when it comes to these issues. And for me, sort of the quintessence of this disorientation, moral and empirical, is the response of the Europeans to the Muhammad Adua story, in which you had a woman who's not even left-wing. I mean, she's considered sort of independent, centrist, if not slightly to the right, a news anchor, Catherine Ney, who at the sort of height of the fury about Adua said this death, I always put a sick after this death. This death replaces the picture of a boy in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Exactly.
So, you know, what she's doing is saying, look, this picture allegedly of a boy who was shot in a crossfire that, according to the journalist who told the story, was started by his own side. This boy who was shot in a crossfire, the picture replaces and erases the picture that symbolizes the systematic extermination of 1 million children, 6 million people. So, you know, that empirically completely detached from reality and morally totally disoriented. How does this happen? How do people who are allegedly smart, who are allegedly moral and care, your group of feminists who are passionate about the morality, I mean, feminism was a moral cause. How could they be so stupid?
Well, it's not just feminists, I have to say. It's academics in general and human rights workers in general. First, you have to understand something about brainwashing and programming. And once there's a image that's repeated, that you have a paradigm, an intellectual paradigm that makes sense of that image to you, and people also are herd animals. We're tribal still. And therefore, if your peer group from whom you get friendship and funding, and you may lose your job if you don't agree with them, thinks thus and such, well, then you don't necessarily go against it, or you really, I mean, I was sitting, and it's in the book, I was sitting with a very, very smart, feminist, beautiful writer about a mile away from Ground Zero. a couple of months after 9/11. And she began to say, they deserved it, we deserve it, and I said, are you saying that 3,000 plus innocent people who just went to work deserve to be murdered? I mean, collective punishment for the crimes committed by who? And she went on in a fugue state. And I could see she was not in her body, that she was speaking like communist-style indoctrination, like brainwashing of some kind. Well, yes, but it was not Christian. So I have not spoken to her since. And of course, this is someone who's also against Israel. Israel is the code word, you see, for misogyny. Israel represents, that's the religion that murdered the goddess, which never was worshipped, alas. That's the religion that...
right, the sun god religion that killed Gaia, the earth goddess.
Monotheism, and it led to Catholicism, and the church is against women, and the abortion issue, et cetera, and so the fix is in. And the question is, how do you undo programming, brainwashing? One way is we peel, let's stick to Al-Dura for a minute. The story is far from over. This kid maybe wasn't murdered. If he was murdered, it was on purpose, a sacrifice for the Palestinian cause, right? And somebody says, Al-Dura didn't happen, or the Jews didn't do it, the Israelis are not guilty, and gets sued by Charles Enderlin. Philippe Carcenti gets sued.
Charles Enderlin defending his honor.
Yes, and many lawsuits later, yes, many lawsuits later, Philippe is still legally in trouble over this. Now look, let's remember that France is the country of Dreyfus, which gave us Herzl, which helped give us the State of Israel. France is the very place that voted today to recognize a Palestinian entity, which by definition, if you want to unpack what that means, it means kill the Jews. That's what it means very simply. And I am in favor of Palestinians rising up against their corrupt, tyrannical leaders, their fascist thugs who've been veiling the women and allowing honor murdering and daughter beating to go on even more so. I stand with Bassem Eid, who had a very good piece today in the Jerusalem Post. He said that the Palestinians are responsible for Palestinian destiny and ought to take charge of UNRWA and get rid of it or transform it radically, that extraordinary boondoggle, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, for one refugee group only. There are refugee groups all over the world who don't have the special protection of the UN. And the UN, in my opinion, has been ineffective in all things save one. It has legalized Jew hatred. That's all. It has been. It's major. It has not stopped a single genocide, ever.
Well, wait. We don't know the genocides that it stopped.
Rwanda? Sudan?
No. We know the ones that it didn't stop, but we don't know the ones
that... Oh, come on, you're just being funny.
So on the one hand, we think, oh, these people are beneath us. When, the book called Eurabia by Batya, she describes this deal that the Europeans struck with the Arabs. And basically it was, we'll bring in all these immigrants to do our dirty work. We'll side with them diplomatically against Israel with the Arab world. That's, part
we'll get an oil break.
We'll get an oil break and so on. And these immigrants who are coming in come from an inferior culture. We don't have to worry about them. Right? And now all of a sudden they're waking up to the fact that this culture is far more vigorous than their own culture is. So arrogance on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think that the kind of lack of curiosity, Phyllis was saying earlier that, for the longest time she resisted seeing this as a religious war. Nobody wants to believe that we're at war with 1.6 billion Muslims. I don't think we're at war with 1.6 billion Muslims. I think we're at war with an indeterminate number of Islamists and their armed, what is it called, the military arm of jihadis, their fighting forces. That's what we're at war with. We have no idea how big it is because we keep telling ourselves it's a tiny minority and that the vast majority are moderate. We know nothing about this. partly because we don't want to know anything about this. I don't think it's that we're incurious. I think it's that we're afraid to find out. And so what do? The Israelis do this too. There's this, I call it masochistic omnipotence syndrome, which is it's all our fault. And if only we could be better, we could fix everything.
It's also battered wife syndrome.
Ze biyadenu, right? It's in our hands. We can do this. It's under our control. So we fantasize it's under our control by not acknowledging what we're dealing with.
Which is a great, great danger. I'm glad that you made this point. Let's go back to the 60s for a minute, quickly, because we then learned, that's what we learned in the West, to sanctify the victim. Whoever was a victim couldn't be a criminal or a barbarian or a religious fanatic or a sociopath. A victim was somebody who was wronged, probably by white Western authorities, and we had to immediately throw our sympathy toward the victim. So that way
and holding the victim responsible was blaming the victim.
Right, so you don't do that. You don't blame or hold responsible or really begin to look at the real so-called victim, right? That's a big no-no. So I think that the West is also, I think what Richard said, masochistic omnipotence, arrogance, and terror. I think that people who haven't written this book about the new anti-Semitism are more terrified than I am about jihad. That's what I think. Whether anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism matters to young people. The point is, one of the things I write about is that this version of Jew hatred is not only global, but it's visually viral. There are doctored documentaries that people watch over and over again and believe this is the truth. So I write about it in a book. I didn't take it into the internet with cartoons or maps or graphs or interactive stuff, but I would love to work with someone who could do that, who does that. So I think really the question is still, do books matter? It's not this particular book or some theories in this book. Whether books in classrooms, I just spoke to a professor friend of mine last night who said that she uses films. Wuthering Heights, you read it, and then Wuthering Heights is a film and compare them. So we're dealing with different trends of receiving information. So I think anyone who reads books and who didn't read this when it came out, it will be a stunning eye-opener now, if it's not too late, if they read books.
Let me answer a different aspect of that question and then go into the question that you asked me. The question you asked me was, ISIS is showing genius at using the internet. Are there past examples? So first, on the subject of anti-Semitism, to go back, I hate to sound like a history professor, one of the lessons of history is that anti-Semitism hurts anti-Semites. That, there's a tendency on the part of anti-Semites to think that dumping on Jews is a freebie. In this particular case, when dumping on Jews feeds the fires of jihad, it's not only not a freebie, you are literally playing with explosives. So I think that getting that across is a way to stop the eye rolling when it comes to this. And by the way, I have bad news and good news on this. The good news is that our warnings are eventually going to reach people, because the bad news is it's only going to get worse. The liberal position on Islamophobia, et cetera, is let's not go there because I think this is all going to pass away. So, don't get into denouncing it. Don't go down that slippery slope to whatever they mean when they say racism. Don't go towards fascism. Drop the subject and it'll go away, and it's not going to go away. So on the one hand, it's bad news, it's not going to go away. On the other hand, our arguments are going to begin to resonate all the time more strongly.
The question is, will it be too late, and
Will
too
it be
late
too
for
late?
what?
Right. Okay. So the second thing, you asked me about historically speaking, and in fact, this next semester I'm teaching one of my favorite courses, which is called Communications Revolutions from Language to Cyberspace. And one of the things that we see with printing is that huge impact on new religious movements, which are early adopters of new technology of communication. So, for example, advertising starts when book publishers would publish a whole bunch of title pages and then use them as flyers to advertise the books that they had just published. If we had all the flyers that were published in the first 50 years or first 100 years of printing, say from 1450 to 1550, the overwhelming majority of them would be about astrology and apocalyptic. Apocalyptic thrives in these communities, and there are all kinds of people who believe that the new technology is there precisely because now they can get their message out, and the new technology is a sign of the times. So, you know, what happens with Luther at the beginning of the 16th century is that you have this huge proliferation of material, some of it ferociously nasty, you know, the Pope is Antichrist and stuff, really disgusting stuff. And not that I'm a great fan of the Pope, and certainly not a great fan of the early 16th century popes, but really, you know, Pope is Antichrist, really eschatological, Said doesn't seem to know the difference, but all of them together. And when the internet came in, the first groups to be on the internet were apocalyptic groups. The first Jewish group on the internet was?
No.
Chabad. Absolutely. And you could see it, and you could see that the jihadis were going to take this, and this is again one of the ways in which we underestimate them. We say, oh well, you know, internet, that's, you know, Western, they can't get that.
No, they like
They're
the technology.
unbelievably
They
shrewd.
like the technology.
Unbelievably
They want the
shrewd.
fast cars, the
Right.
fast planes, the most advanced weaponry,
Right.
explosives.
And in fact, what
happy with it, the fact that it grew out of a Western civilization and not out of the so-called flowering of Arab civilization
Right.
based
Doesn't
on
matter.
Roman Greek culture.
Doesn't
matter.
So-
doesn't matter. They want to take what
Right.
they want.
So in the late third, early fourth century, a Christian theologian named Eusebius wrote a book called Preparatio Evangelii, which was the preparation of the Gospels, and he argued that the Roman Empire had been created more or less as a vehicle for Christian messianism. It was Messiah's donkey. That the Roman Empire, by subduing the entire world, by building roads, et cetera, made it possible for Christians to go everywhere to spread their message. What we're dealing with in the early 21st century is that jihadis believe that modernity and the internet is preparatio califati. They believe that what we have done by globalizing the world is to lay down the paths whereby they are going to take over. And they're doing it.
So given your analogies, historically, are you saying that they're doomed to failure?
Wait, the
jihadis.
Christians, no.
Jihadis.
No, I mean, they're doomed to failure because if they take over, they're going to create a dystopia. But there's nothing to say that they're not going to take over. I mean, so they will fail in creating the sort of wonderful caliphate that they imagine, but that doesn't mean that they won't actually
So they
create
could bring
a
us
caliphate.
back to the
They could
7th
bring it-
century.
We could be looking at another
I
dark
could be
age.
speaking to you under a burqa, and I once lived in Kabul, Afghanistan, so I do know,
You know what it's like.
what I speak about. You know, I was asked to do a one-on-one interview on C-SPAN, and I said, well, who's the interviewer? Oh, Golbag Bashi. I said, let me call you back. She turned out to be married to Hamida Bashi, who's Edward Said's heir. She turned out to have gotten her PhD under Lila Abulugud and Chakraborty Spivak. And if you know their work, you know what I'm saying. So I called back and said, Ah, gee, I can't do it that night. Get me another Iranian interviewer if it has to be an Iranian interviewer. My question, though, unanswered, is who knew her and connected it to me, and who was ready to have me attacked on Israel when I was there to discuss An American Bride in Kabul, when I was there to talk about Islamic gender apartheid and jihad and bin Laden? Who knew to do that? I don't have the answer to the question. It remains an important open question, and that goes back to what Larry said about the money that's been poured into Western culture and into America that has funded universities, scholarships, think tanks, poured in for 50 plus years while we, what is it, the phrase, we drank the Kool-Aid. Drank the Kool-Aid.
So we have to finish up.
I would like to say one thing. I'm working on this project, Institute for Cognitive War, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is essentially to chronicle the catastrophic events of the last 15 years. And so if any of you have sort of thoughts on or memories of key moments in this process, what happened during the Jenin massacre in your particular part of the universe, or if you remember the first time you saw or heard about Muhammad Adua and so on, the cartoon scandal, etc. All of these are really key moments in a process that we need to understand in order to be able to counter. And so if any of you have thoughts and want to communicate them to me, indeed, if you have an archive of stuff that you've collected, I have a couple of people in France and a couple of people in Israel who just clipped paper articles and incredibly valuable stuff that you can't get on the internet. So please consider being in touch.
See him, see him. Thank you all for coming. Chazak v'yamatz.